goes on, right? Azatov and starting in Succca, it's very exciting. Just say two small tiny points. One is that there are the number of special mitzvahs on sukkahs. Primarily, it's the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah and the mitzvah of Abba Minim. The Orchane asks the question that the mitzvah of Abba Minim is said first in the Torah. Since it's said first in the Torah, you would have expected that it should be first in the Masechta. And he gives a very interesting answer. Anybody want to guess the answer the Orchane gives?
It's more encompassing.
He says because it's the first. It says because it's first. First night sukkah, you sit in the sukkah. You don't start your minimum things. So if you need to know the halachas of this one, put the halachas of that one. That's a good question. Yeah. It doesn't go according to order though. In the Masechta we saw by Yomi, Shiva Sam Kodim Yom Kippurim, and etc. One other small point is that there are many Masechtas of God in Yom Tov. That's why Beitza is Alchas Yom Tov, Moed Katan is Alchas Chol HaMoed, Chagiga is the halachas of the Korbanos being the Beis Hamikdash. So what's Sukkah about? Sukkah is about the halachas which are unique to Sukkahs. That's the point to remember. That means the some which are Beitza, Moed Katan, and Chagiga are like general Yom Tovim. Every Yom Tov has it, right? And Pesach have Sukkahs and Shavuos. But these, the Sukkah Pesachim is the ones which were made for the individual ones. Okay. Sukkah Sukkah, which is 120 anos, is possible. Every Yiddish child knows this Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Machshir. Rabbi Yehuda said it's okay. If it's not 10 tefachim high, 10 tefachim each tefach is approximately according to Chazanish 9.6 centimeters. So 96 centimeters, less than 96 centimeters high. If it doesn't have 3 walls, if there's more sun than shade, it is possible. And Rashi says that, let's just see the Rashi, because it comes out, the minority is cancelled, is bottled in the majority. It's as if you got no schach at all. Hashem has schach kvuyo sukkah. Rashi says this in a number of places, quite a lot of places in the sukkah. Schach, sukkah is called because of the schach. So therefore, if there's no schach, you've got no sukkah. And since there's only a minority of schach, it's bottom b'voiv of the sun. And Rashi many times uses that because that means if somebody's got walls, we don't really care so much about the walls, don't care about anything. The main thing of the sukkah is the schach. And therefore, if there's no schach, you've got no sukkah. Says the Gemara. Then also we learned in the Mishnah Neuvin, Mobu should go by Mesamam, or Mobu, which is 120 amos, you might. You should lower it. Rabbi Yehuda says it's not necessary. And the question is, Ma'ishno gabi sukkah to tani psula, Ma'ishno gabi Mobu to tani kanta. By Mobu, it says, what should you do? And by Sukkah, it just says possible. Why is that different? Let's just briefly explain the halachas of Mobu, which we've had quite a lot of times. In it, the halacha is min ha-Torah, you're not allowed to carry from a private domain to a public domain. But from a private to private is permitted. So if I've got my garden next to your garden, I'm allowed to carry from my garden to your garden min ha-Torah. There's no problem. With Rabbanon, they forbade it, because if you come from one rishus to another, from one domain to another, you'll end up carrying. You're meant to carry to a proper rishus rabbi. And therefore, if you've got a movi is similar to a cul-de-sac, like Castleford Avenue, where off it is coming a number of small chatzeros. Chatzeros are courtyards which a number of houses open up to. So a person to carry from the chotzer to the movi, midrabanon is also. Why is it midrabanon also? Because the movi belongs to everybody that lives off that road. The chotzer belongs to the people who are living around the chotzer. So when your person carries from the chotzer to the movi, he is carrying essentially from rishus to rishus, from one domain to another. It's not rishus hayachet to rishus rabbi, because neither of them the movi is not rishus rabbi. It's all rishus hayachet, but it's different kinds of rishus hayachet. So with Rabbanon they forbade it. So now what did they say? They said that if you make a sign to make it clear that it's not rishus rabbi, that is either a lechi or a koyo. A lechi is a post to the sides of the entrance, or a koyo is a beam across. Plus, everybody who living in that movi takes a piece of bread or wine and they add it all together and put it in one person's home. Then what happens is you're allowed to carry within the movi and you're allowed to carry from the chotzer to the movi. But the purpose of the koyo, the beam that goes across the entrance of the movi, what's the purpose? to make it recognizable that it's not a Rishus Rabbim. If it's higher than 20 amas, who's ever going to be able to see it? So therefore, the Tanakhama says you have to lower it. Rabbi Yehuda says it's not necessary, you can leave it as it is. Now, it's very interesting that they both hold similar to they hold here. Here, Rabbi Yehuda holds also 20 amas higher. But the Gemara there explains that it's not connected, it's not the same machlokas, it's a different logic. But the main question of the Gemara is that why over there does it say what should you do to rectify the situation, and why over here does it just say possible without telling us a solution? Why does the Mishnah not say you might lower it, or there say possible? And the Gemara gives two answers. Sukkah deiraisa, sukkah which is min hativa, that you have to have a kosher sukkah toni psula, it says possible. Movu durabbanon, which is only durabbanon, toni takanta, tells us the solution. Rashi explains not simply that one's deiraisa, one's durabbanon, but it's much more than that. When we have a psul deiraisa, means the Torah told us to make a sukkah, and then what happens is you've done it wrong, so now it's possible. You haven't done what the Torah said. By Movu, without the Mishnah saying anything, I wouldn't have even known I need a beam, because the Torah never told me I need a beam, and I tell me allowed to carry wherever I want within the Movu, because it's all Rosh Hashanah. It's only the Mishnah was the first one to tell me that it is wrong. So if the Mishnah can't tell me psula, if I say to you, for example, please give me a drink, and then you give me a drink and it's no good, I could say to you, it's possible, because at the end of the day, I asked for a drink, and then the second time when you pour me the drink, you brought it incorrectly, it's possible. But if I have never asked for the drink and you bring it to me, I can't say to you, possible, that it's invalid. I've never yet told you that we need a drink. I can say to you, actually, I prefer it like this. This Mishnah is going after the Torah said the Sukkah station Shiva Sam. The Torah already told us to sit in the Sukkah. So you already know to build a Sukkah. And now you're going to do it wrong. It says possible. By Mavui, the Torah never ever told it to us. This is the first place which we've ever come across the idea they even need a beam. So you can't tell me possible that it's invalid for what I've asked you. You haven't asked me anything yet. So the only thing I can say to you is this is not the one I wanted. I wanted one which is lower. Please lower it. It is a subtle point, but it's interesting. Rashi doesn't say it's just because one's device and one's to bottom. It says because one is already being told that it's forbidden, and therefore now it's possible it's not done incorrectly. But Shikid over here, there, it's the first time we're being asked, therefore it just tells us the counter. That's one answer. Even by the Deraisa, it could also say a solution. When you Succca to the Fisha Milsa, there's many different halachas. The problem is the Mishnah is telling us a lot of different halachas. More than 20 amas, less than 3 walls, too low, less than 10 tefachim, if it's got not enough shade. Each time, the Mishnah doesn't want to tell us the solution because it'll be a very long-winded Mishnah. And Rashi tells us the shorter a statement is, the easier it is for people to absorb it. So therefore, we want it to be as succinct as possible. So therefore, the Mishnah says possible. Morbid in office middays, and you got one halacha, it tells us the solution. Rashi points out there's a lot of halachas in Morbid, but that whole Mishnah only has one halacha in Morbid. Since that Mishnah only has one halacha, so therefore it only needs to say the solution. That means our Mishnah, if it would say the solution, Sukkah less than 20 amas, make it more than 20 amas, make it lower. Sukkah, which has got less than 3 walls, add a wall. Sukkah, which that would be very long-winded. This just says possible, and eventually you can work it out. How do we know that the Sukkah, which is more than 20 amas, how many is possible? And what the Gemara does is the Gemara gives a number of different sources, and later the Gemara eventually works the differences. That means this is going to be a long sugya now. How do we know that a Sukkah more than 20 amas high is possible? Omar Rabba, the Omar called man yedu do yisechem ki Sukkah is the shaftes for the Yisroel. In order that your generation should know that you sat in the Sukkah. Rashi explains that the simple explanation, the real explanation of the pasuk is that the reason we sit in the Sukkah is to remind us of the fact that we actually put us in Ananei HaKovod. But another way of reading the pasuk is not that in the past I sat you in the Sukkah. That's the simple explanation. You should sit in the Sukkah, that you should remember that in the past I sat in the Sukkah. But the generation should know that I have told you to sit in the Sukkah. Meaning that there's a mitzvah in this pasuk that you should know that you're sitting in the Sukkah. Kiba Sukkah Shavti is referring to the present, that when you're sitting in the Sukkah, you should know that you're meant to be sitting in the Sukkah. After 20 hours, he's aware they sit in the Sukkah. The person does not know he's sitting in the Sukkah. I once said this as an example, that if anybody goes to a mech, what is the shape of the ceiling of a mech? Does anybody know? It's like a dome, but most people are not aware. Why? Because it's quite high. You're not aware of something which is very high. A low ceiling, you're aware very clearly what it is. when something's very high, you don't notice it. So over here, if it's more than 20 amas, you're not aware of it, and therefore, again, the simple explanation I need to do is that you should know when you sit in the sukkah that you sat in the sukkah originally. It's to celebrate the tremendous kindness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we sat in the Ananei HaKavod. But another way to read, I need to do a sikkah because sukkah is shavti. There's a mitzvah to know that you sit in the sukkah. More than 20 amas, you're not aware that you sit in the sukkah. The famous Bach, the Bach writes that even though with all mitzvahs, if you know that you sit in, you have to eat matzah, but you forget that your shvocha took you out to mitzvah, you may kaim the mitzvah. By sukkah, you're not mekayim the mitzvah. Why? Because the only place in the Torah tells you that what should you do for a reason. The man yedu do sukkah. Now from here we know that the man, in order that you should know that it's because of Anani HaKavod. The Mishnah brings it in his Choshesh Fort. I was once every time talking by Succas, and he told me that what he does this, and then he's not the only one. There's many people. And as they come into the sukkah, the first night, sukkahs they say to the children, you should know that according to the Bach, you only make a mitzvah of sukkah if you have kavanah, not just, besides the normal kavanahs of the kiyum mitzvah and the mitzvah, also there's a second kavanah. When you're eating, you have to have kavanah that you're eating because it's like first kazayis matzah, first kazayis challah eating sukkah. But according to the Bach, you have to have a kavanah that we should know that the reason we're doing it is because we sat in Anani HaKavod. The Shiur brings it as a chashash. Okay.
Where does it look like the amas specifically come from?
That's a logic. The more than 20 amas, a person doesn't notice the roof. Less than 20 amas. That means like this. Rabbi learned from the pasuk that you have to be aware you're sitting in the sukkah. He worked it out from his own scientific research that 20 amas is the limit of what a person notices. More than 20 amas, a person doesn't notice already. No, he didn't learn from Rabbi because Rabbi learned from because Rabbi is also learned from that. Are you with me or not with me?
Yeah, but it's just his opinion. There's no source.
No, his opinion is where do we know that you have to even know that you're sitting in the shade of a sukkah? That he learns it from this pasuk. The Gemara is going to argue with him and say to him that pasuk doesn't mean that. The pasuk means that you should remember that Anani HaKavod. Yeah. That's his part is that you have to know that you sit in the sukkah. Now that's his main source. Now the fact that at 20 amas a person's aware is something which the Gemara never even argues about. Maybe that's something which was understood. But that's just true. Everybody knows there's a limit to how much you notice. That means he understood that from his own understanding. This pasuk is actually referring to Mr. Mashiach, that we will sit in the shelter of the sukkah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it will protect us from the heat of the Gehenna of the sun. So now, we see that the sukkah is something which is made for protection. When it's up to 20 amas, we sit in the shade of the sukkah. He's not sitting in the shade of the sukkah, he's sitting in the shade of the walls. Like this. When you've got a very, very high ceiling, so what happens is 99% of the time, what's protecting you is not the ceiling. Unless it's midday and you're living, where is about the equator, then it's midday, you'll get this shade. But generally speaking, in England certainly, and even in the sun, most of the time the sun never actually reaches the very, very middle. Since the sun never reaches the middle, and we said that the purpose of a sukkah is to protect you from the heat. So therefore, if you've got a very, very tall sukkah, you're not getting protected from the heat, you get protected from the walls, not from the... And again, Rashi says the same words. What does Rashi say? That... and the Shevach is the sukkah, right? The schach is called the sukkah, not the walls. Now, here, this obvious question is that this depends a very lot on the width of the sukkah. If you've got a very, very, very wide sukkah, so then even if the walls are very high, you're still getting the shade of the ceiling. If you've got very narrow sukkah, not. The more later discusses this point. But this point that you're getting the shade of the walls, it depends on how much space there is between the walls. Okay.
Very narrow sukkah, even less than sukkah.
That's right, very good. A very narrow sukkah even less, and a very wide sukkah even more. Abai asks a different question. If you make it in a valley where there's two high cliffs, or Chanami de have a sukkah is not a sukkah. You can't compare. If you take away the cliffs, it could sell sukkah. You've got the shade of the sukkah. Meaning like this. There, it is true that you've got no sun because you've got the cliffs, you'll never get sun. But without the cliffs, the sukkah there is a protection. Only you don't need it, you've got the cliffs. When you've got very, very high sukkah, the protection you're getting from the schach will never provide you protection. Meaning like this, that if the schach has the possibility of providing you protection, that's good enough. The fact that you've got other things to protect you, a wall or a tree or cliff, that doesn't matter. But when it's more than 20 amos high, the ceiling never has the ability to protect you because it's so high, it's not protecting you at all. It's so high that it's not giving you any shade at all because where the sun's reflecting, the shade is elsewhere, not underneath it. So we've got two explanations so far. One is that you have to know you're sitting in the sukkah and it's more than 20 amos you're not aware. One, because you need to have the shade of the schach, and you're not getting the shade of the schach when it's more than 20 amos high. Now the Torah could have said Shivas Yomi for 7 days, Teishu Sukkah, you should sit in the sukkah. It doesn't say like that. It says Sukkah's Teishu Shivas Yomi. That means the word 7 days is not just referring to how many days you should sit, but it's also reflecting on what kind of sukkah you should build. By Sukkah's Teishu Shivas Yomi, you should sit in the sukkah of 7 days. Almost Shivas Yomi Sevitiras Keva, the Shevitiras Ai. This is Al-Khaneh points out this in the Kudah. That if the Torah would have written for 7 days, sit in the sukkah, you just said sit in the sukkah. For 7 days, sit in any sukkah. It doesn't say that. It said the sukkah sit for 7 days. Says the Torah that for 7 days go out of a permanent house. The Shevitiras Ai sit in a temporary one, which is usually made for 7 days. Up to 20 amos is Avai. Sorry, in order to build it, one has to make it very, very strong. It has to be fixed. If you make it out of iron, if you make a metal sukkah, it's not a sukkah. He can make a duras arai, he's even if it's keva. So therefore, it's not possible to make it arai. And the Torah says, the 7 days tells us that it has to be something which is a 7-day building. More than 20 amos is not a 7-day building. So we've got so far 3 explanations. One is it has to be tiras arai. One is you have to have the shade of the schach. And one is because it has to be the man needed to do we have to be aware. Top of base on base. Kulu Yomi, they don't agree with Rabbi, which says the man needed to do that the simple explanation is that you should know when you're sitting in the sukkah that Hashem put you in Ananei HaKovot. So therefore, there's nothing to do with the sukkah that you're sitting in at the moment. It's remembering in future generations the previous sukkah that Hashem put us. So you don't need to be aware that you're sitting in the Sil sukkah. That he says that the sukkah has to be protected from the heat. That's referred to as a Mashiach, that Hashem will make us a protection from the heat of the Seder. Normally, when the Torah talks about a canopy, a protection, the Torah uses the word chuppah. Here, the Torah uses the word sukkah, even though it's not going to be a real sukkah, it's going to be the Rishon V'yosa. So, what's the point? Well, my sukkah, the fact that the Torah, instead of using the word chuppah, uses the word sukkah, it teaches us that elsewhere, where the Torah uses the word sukkah, the Torah also wants it to be a protection from the sun. Again, the Torah is there, you're right. The Torah there is telling us that when Mashiach comes, Hashem will make us a protection from all the heat of all the Gehenna and all the rest. But the Torah doesn't use the word chuppah, the Torah uses the word sukkah to teach us that elsewhere when the Torah uses the word sukkah, it's for protection. Abaya's question was what? That if you make it out of iron, then it's going to be a sukkah. And the Rabbi's answer that it's potential to be arai, the Gemara never liked, and therefore they didn't hold the Rabbi. We're going to have now 3 different people that limit the machlekes. In our Mishnah, just says more than 20 amos. Chacham say possible. Rabbi says kosher. We have 3 amorim that come along and limit the machlekes. It's not in all cases, and we're going to try and examine whose logic did they go to understand who that we are that to limit the machlekes. Rabbi said the name of Rav. Machlekes Hashem tfanis v'gis eschach. If the walls don't reach the schach, we're going to learn a special halacha called good asik mechitza. Good asik mechitza means that if the walls go up like over here, and if you put the schach and there's a space, it doesn't matter. The wall goes up. It's halacha l'meishmi Sinai. That walls go up. So if you've got the schach and then a gap and then the walls, then it's a machlek if it's kosher, if it's more than 20 amos. But if the walls actually reach the schach, then even more than 20 amos is okay. It says, well, if the walls reach the schach, then even more than 20 amos is kosher. Come on. But that's the first opinion. Rabbi said the reason is you don't notice the roof. Now, when there's a space, you don't notice the roof because you see the walls, and then there's a space, you don't look at the ceiling. But when the walls reach the ceiling, your eye travels up the ceiling, and then you notice the roof as well. So Gemara says it's like Rabbi. This is the Oma again. Command because the eye doesn't notice it. The eye does notice it. So that Amoira, according to Rav, limits the machlokas. That if the walls reach the schach, then it's okay more than 20 amas because you'll notice the roof. Command. Because the Mishnah doesn't say. The Mishnah often.
If the schach is more than 20 amas,
Right. Only if the walls don't reach the schach. But if the walls. That means you ask you a question many times. What the Gemara does is it limits the Mishnah. Whereas the Mishnah says a statement, and the Gemara says they were only arguing in this case, they were only arguing in that case. Mishnah don't talk about that case. The answer is that Rabbi wrote the minimal amount. Rabbi didn't want to write anything. The reason he didn't want to write anything is because all the years they never wrote anything. But in fact, over what happened was he realized that people have to have some sort of text to remind them. But Rabbi never expected us to learn Mishnahs without it being taught from our rabbis. And when they learned the Mishnah, that's how they learned the Mishnah. That Rabbi, it's like, for example, sometimes you get like you're doing a course, and with the course you get a bit of text based, and mostly it's lectures. Now a person looks at the text and complains and says, "I don't understand. This text doesn't teach me everything." The answer, of course not, because it's supposed to be part of a course, and the course involves the lecturer explaining to you what it is. That the text is only to be able to help you focus a little bit. This is the reality when it comes to Mishnahs. The Gemara many times even says that the Mishnah is missing some words. The answer was Rabbi Yehuda Nossi never expected us to have the words of the Mishnah and that's it. He expected us to learn the Mishnahs from our Rebbes. And it's a very important point in understanding the whole basis of what a Mishnah is. A Mishnah was never meant to be, the Gemara in fact writes that the person who learns Mishnahs without a Rebbe is not nowadays a Rebbe would be the mafoshim of the Mishnah. Is learning in vain. I think the words the Gemara says it's like learning for nothing because you without having the explanations that go with the Mishnah, it's like reading a text of a course without having the lectures and then wondering what the word in the text means. The word carries on the second the person who limits the Mishnah. The whole machlokes of Mishnah is only if it's a very small sukkah, 4x4. If it's got more than 4 amas, if it's more than 20 amas, kosher. Now this, what's the logic? If it's bigger than 4 amas, it's kosher. Once it's very, very big, more than 4 amas, then you get the tzil sukkah because even if it's more than 20 amas high, you get the shade of the schach because it's very, very wide. I want to explain this a little bit. The halacha is the minimal sukkah that we pass is a sukkah that holds Rosh V'Ruba, his head and most of his body. Rashi explains that in the olden days, the way they would sit in the sukkah is they would sit lying down. People would sit lying down, not like us sitting up. You eat on the that's how we do the Suvan on Pesach. That was considered the way, a comfortable way of eating. So what happened, even though nowadays we've had it extremely uncomfortable, I don't know how they did it, but that's how they did it. So you have to have, when you're lying in the sukkah, Rosh V'Ruba, because otherwise you're not inside the sukkah. Nowadays you don't need so much because you could just be literally standing in the sukkah, you could be much less. So the minimum amount is 7 tvachim. You should be aware that sometimes people sit in the sukkah and they open only part of the roof and they've not got Rosh V'Ruba. You have to have Rosh V'Ruba with sukkah and shul. The halacha is the
size of the sukkah, not the size of the wall.
So I didn't catch on what?
That's the size of the sukkah.
The schach, that's the size of the schach. Yeah, you're right. You have to. If you can't count the walls, if you've got a different kumah, that's it. The schach is only in the middle.
Last night,
Yeah. Yes. That's right. It's only the area of the schach that's counted. Right. So now came along Rabbi Chanel, and he said that if the sukkah is even a tiny bit bigger than the most minimal shiur, then it doesn't matter if it's more than 20 amas high. Says the well, who does that fit like? Commander like nobody. Now the obvious suggestion would be that it fits in like the mandama of the shade, because since it's slightly bigger, so if it's possible to get the shade of the roof. Says Rashi, no. Because since it's higher than 20 amas, and it's only a little bit bigger than the minimal shade, so then it doesn't make sense that the shade should reach Bishlam. It's okay according to the one who said 4 amas, because that's a very big sukkah. So a big sukkah, it's possible to have shade even if it's more than 20 amas high, like you go very high, so you need the roof. But over here, since it's only a tiny bit bigger than the most minimal shiur, that's not enough to say that the roof should take in. It says, should we stop here? Again, there's people, okay, should we do a bit more? What's the majority? I'll go. You're fine. You're fine. A few months. We'll go up to. Bishlam is Abiyah Pligad Rav Huna Rav Chanan Bar Rava. Then said Abiyah argues Rav Huna Rav Chanan Bar Rava. Tiluki Yavishur b'Mishcha. Viluki Yavishur b'Mishcha. That means all these Amorim, they all spoke in the name of Rav. If you notice, Rav Huna Marav, Chanan Bar Rava Marav, Abiyah Marav. They all spoke in the name of Rav. That means they all came along in the name of Rav, and they limited our Mishnah. Now, one of them came and he spoke about the walls not touching the ceiling. The other two came and they argued about the size of the sukkah. One said if it's more than 4 amos, then it doesn't matter if it's more than 20 amos. And one said if it's more than 7 tvachim, it doesn't matter. Now, the first one argues with the other two because he says, Rav never spoke about the size of the sukkah. You misunderstood Rav. Rav was speaking about when the walls touch the ceiling. They're all arguing when Rav limited the Mishnah, in what way did he limit it? The first man says Rav limited it, that the walls don't reach the schach. They came along and said, no, he limited it regarding the size of the sukkah. But when they two they're arguing just in size. And the question is, what made them argue in the size of the sukkah? They both heard from Rav. The Rav said, our Mishnah is talking about a small sukkah. So one of them understood if it's less than 4 amos, by 4 amos, that's what the Mishnah is talking about. The other one came and understood where it's the most minimal shiur. What did they argue about that they both understood Rav in different ways? The other man, Domar, he understood the Rav as well, something else completely. But those two, what did they argue about? Again, they were talking about sizes, measurements. Later we're going to have a machlokas. What's the minimal sukkah? One man says 4 amos by 4 amos, and one man says 7 tvachim by 7 tvachim, which is Rosh Hashanah. Now, I mentioned that we passed the Rosh Hashanah, but the more understood that maybe the machlokas Amorim over here is that same machlokas Tanoim later. What's the minimal sukkah? And they both understood the Rav said, and the minimal sukkah, that's the machlokas of our Mishnah. And then the question was, what is a minimal sukkah? One man says 4 amos, one man says 7 tvachim. The Maaseh sukkah ba'aba amos, the Maaseh sukkah says, well, look, the kulam sukkah everybody agrees the size of a sukkah is the minimal amount. Not like Rabbi there later. The Maaseh it's all kosher because you've got the shade of the schach. So no, the Rashi says that the Kul Tamad, we don't know why. Why it should be kosher if it's more than 7 tvachim? Rashi says, we don't know why it should be kosher because it's just a tiny bit more than 7 tvachim. What's the logic? It is all kosher. Meisvi. You know, it's better stop over here because this is a whole new thing. We'll stop over here. Meisvi. I don't want to rush it because it's interesting more. Right. You can put on the group that will start on Shabbos for Meisvi. The Gemara wants to suggest there's 3 people all discussing what is the limitation of our Mishnah. One speaks about the rules not reaching the ceiling. The other 2 speak about measurements. So one said that one can understand why he argues with the other 2 because he heard Rav speaking about walls reaching the ceiling, not about size. But the other 2, they're both arguing about size. If they're both arguing about size, why did one choose 7 tvachim and one choose 4 amos? The Gemara wanted to suggest that they're arguing what is a kosher sukkah. We'll have later machlokas is a kosher sukkah 4 amos by 4 amos or 7 tvachim by 7 tvachim. They want to suggest that these two are arguing the same machlokas of the Tanoim later. Says, well, no. Everybody agrees, like we passed them, that the kosher sukkah is 7 tvachim. Only they argue when the Chachamim over here in our Mishnah say more than 20 amos is possible, what were they talking about? Were they talking about the most minimal sukkah of all? Or were they talking about a sukkah up to 4 amos? But of course, if it would be less than 20 amos, that means according to the second man Doma, of course, even if it's more than that, then you don't need it to be. Sorry, if it's more than 20 amos, that's when it's possible from 7 tvachim to 4 amos. Exactly this. The machlokas over here of Amorim, what's our Mishnah talking about is not the machlokas of how big a sukkah needs to be kosher. Everybody agrees for the sukkah to be kosher, 7 tvachim is enough. The argument is only when the Chachamim said that more than 20 amos is possible, which kind of sukkah were they talking about?
That's because it's so high, it increases the width.
That's why you need to increase the width in order to be able to get the shade, in order to be able to do it. Have a very good Shabbos.